31 December 1944, Altenkirchen Airfield, Germany, 0430 hours. The frozen ground cracked beneath the boots of Oberleutnant Klaus Mertens as he approached his Focke-Wulf FW-190 A8 in darkness so complete that the aircraft existed only as a deeper shadow against the winter sky. The temperature at -12 Celsius, turning his breath into clouds that hung suspended in the still air before dissolving into nothing. Around him, the airfield hummed with suppressed activity. Ground crews moving between dispersed fighters with hooded flashlights casting brief circles of yellow light across engine cowlings, still warm from the test runs conducted 3 hours earlier. The smell of high-octane fuel and cold metal, sharp enough to taste at the back of his throat. Mertens had received his briefing at 2200 hours the previous evening in a farmhouse converted to a squadron operations center. The walls lined with maps marked in red grease pencil, showing the route they would follow at dawn, a straight line west across the front lines into Belgium, terminus marked at coordinates corresponding to Asch Airfield, designated Y-29 by the Americans, home to squadrons of P-47 Thunderbolts from the 352nd Fighter Group. The operation bore the codename Bodenplatte, German for baseplate, and represented the single largest coordinated strike the Luftwaffe could still mount after 5 years of grinding attrition had reduced fighter strength from the thousands to barely 900 serviceable aircraft, scraped together from training units, defense squadrons, and every reserve that Reichsmarschall Göring could strip from the shrinking borders of the Reich. Mertens climbed into his cockpit at 0445 hours, settling into the cramped seat worn smooth by countless previous pilots, some dead, some captured, some transferred to units that no longer existed, and began the startup sequence with movements made automatic by repetition. Fuel mixture rich, throttle cracked, magnetos on, prime the engine with 3 strokes, then hit the starter and feel the BMW 801 radial cough once, twice, then catch with a roar that sent vibrations through the entire airframe as 14 cylinders began their synchronized explosions. The noise multiplied across the field as engine after engine ignited, creating a wall of sound that would have been audible for kilometers if anyone had been awake to hear it. But the Allied forces were sleeping off New Year's celebrations, their guard lowered by weeks of weather so poor that the Luftwaffe had barely mounted any operations since the start of the Ardennes offensive 16 days earlier. At 0520 hours, the first fighters began taxiing in strings of 4, navigation lights off, following the dim blue ground lights that marked the taxi paths through patches of snow that reflected just enough starlight to be visible as lighter patches against the dark earth. Mertens advanced his throttle and felt his fighter lurch forward, tail lifting as speed increased, the control column responding to gentle pressure as he held formation on the aircraft ahead, their spacing measured in seconds rather than meters because visual contact ended 5 meters beyond each wingtip. The takeoff was instrument flying in near total darkness, airspeed building past 160 kilometers per hour as Mertens rotated and felt the wheels leave frozen ground, gear retracting with hydraulic whine barely audible over engine noise, climbing into clouds at 300 meters that turned the world into gray nothingness, pierced only by the occasional glimpse of a navigation light from another aircraft in the formation. They leveled at 500 meters heading 270, throttled back to conserve fuel for the return flight, flying beneath the cloud deck that meteorologists promised would break before they reached the target zone. The formation numbered over 300 fighters, FW-190s, Bf-109s, even some of the new Me-262 jets, though most of those had been held back due to fuel shortages, organized into groups that would split toward different targets once they crossed into Allied-held territory. Mertens could see nothing of this massive aerial assembly, only the dim shape of his element leader's aircraft, and occasionally the exhaust flames from other machines when they banked and briefly exposed their engine stacks. Radio silence had been absolute since engine start, every pilot navigating by dead reckoning and hoping that the Junkers J-88 Pathfinder aircraft leading each group knew where they were going, because getting lost meant either flying until fuel exhaustion or breaking radio silence and revealing the entire operation to Allied radar stations that had been tracking mysterious formations building over Germany for the past 30 minutes. At 0812 hours, they crossed the front line somewhere over the snow-covered Ardennes forest, marked only by increased flak that rose in black puffs that tumbled and expanded as they climbed, lethal fragments spreading outward in spheres of shrapnel that could shred aluminum skin and sever hydraulic lines. 2 aircraft from the group ahead disappeared in orange fireballs that briefly illuminated the clouds from within before fading to falling debris trailing smoke. The formation pressed forward without braking, holding course even as more flak bursts walked up from below, because turning back meant failure, and failure meant the operation's resources had been wasted, and those resources represented nearly everything the Luftwaffe had left to commit after 5 years of grinding attrition had reduced fighter strength from the thousands to barely 900 serviceable aircraft. At 0828 hours, the clouds thinned and Mertens saw Belgium spread below in patches of snow-covered farmland, villages still dark except for a few early risers lighting fires, roads empty of traffic, and then ahead in the haze he spotted what every pilot had memorized from reconnaissance photographs, the characteristic layout of Asch Airfield with its 2 intersecting runways forming an X, the dispersal areas dotted with the distinctive shapes of Allied fighters parked wingtip to wingtip because nobody expected an attack, and the whole scene peaceful as a training ground, until Mertens nosed over into his attack dive and opened fire with 4 20mm cannons that hammered out shells at 800 rounds per minute combined, the recoil shuddering through the airframe as he watched his tracer rounds walk across a line of P-47s and saw the first one erupt in flames as fuel tanks ruptured and ignited. 2 January 1945. Luftwaffe Command Headquarters, Treuenbrücken, Germany. 1400 hours. Major Wilhelm Stenger sat across from the debriefing officer in a room heated by a wood-burning stove that barely kept the temperature above freezing, his flight suit still smelling of cordite and hydraulic fluid from the mission concluded 30 hours earlier. The officer, a Hauptmann whose name Stenger hadn't caught, pushed a typed form across the desk and waited while Stenger recounted his participation in Operation Bodenplatte with the flat precision required by military documentation. Takeoff time from Nida at 5:15 hours. Target Y-32 Operation Airfield near Maastricht. Flight time 78 minutes. Attack commenced 0834 hours. 17 confirmed strafing runs before fuel state required return to base. Landing Altenkirchen at 10:42 hours due to Nida being bombed while he was airborne. The Hauptmann's pen scratched across paper, recording facts that would become statistics that would eventually inform historians attempting to understand how the Luftwaffe destroyed approximately 300 Allied aircraft on New Year's Day 1945 while simultaneously losing 300 of its own through combination of combat, flak, and navigational errors that sent lost formations into friendly fire from German anti-aircraft batteries not informed of the operation due to security concerns. Stenger had witnessed 3 pilots from his Staffel shot down by German 88mm guns defending Frankfurt, their aircraft simply disintegrating in mid-air as proximity-fused shells detonated close enough to shred control surfaces and sever fuel lines, and he had watched them fall without being able to help because radio silence meant no warning could be transmitted, and breaking that silence would compromise the entire operation. The Hauptmann asked about enemy resistance, and Stenger described minimal air opposition. Most Allied fighters were destroyed on the ground before pilots could reach them, but intense small arms fire from ground personnel who shot back with whatever weapons came to hand. One Mustang mechanic standing atop a burning aircraft, firing a Browning .45 pistol at attacking fighters until cannon fire cut him down. The futility of this resistance had struck Stenger during his attack runs. he was strafing men armed with rifles while flying an aircraft equipped with 4 20mm cannons and 2 13mm machine guns, employing industrial-grade violence against opponents who might as well have been throwing rocks. Yet those men had continued fighting until they physically could not, which spoke to something Stenger recognized as military virtue even when exercised by enemies. The Hauptmann recorded these observations without comment, then moved to the critical question: operational effectiveness. Stenger estimated destroying or damaging 23 Allied aircraft based on observed hits and subsequent fires, with additional unconfirmed damage from strafing runs where results were obscured by smoke. His Staffel had lost 7 aircraft and 6 pilots. 1 bailed out over Allied territory and became prisoner. 1 crashed attempting emergency landing on damaged landing gear. 5 simply failed to return and were presumed killed. This exchange rate, 7 lost for 23 destroyed, might appear favorable until accounting for pilot experience. The 6 dead represented an average 800 flight hours each, trained in pre-war programs that no longer existed, while the 23 destroyed Allied aircraft would be replaced within 3 days using production capacity that churned out fighters faster than pilots could be trained to fly them. The mathematics of attrition favored the side with deeper resources, which meant Bodenplatte represented Germany trading quality for temporary quantity advantage, spending capital that could not be replenished for interest that would not compound. The Hauptmann finished writing and looked up, his expression neutral in the way of men who have stopped believing in victory but continue performing duties because duty is what remains when belief fails. He asked if Stenger had anything to add for the record, and Stenger considered mentioning the weather, perfect visibility on New Year's Day after weeks of clouds that had grounded both sides, a meteorological accident that allowed the operation to proceed, or the fuel expenditure. His FW-190 had burned through 524 liters making the round trip. Multiply that by 900 participating aircraft, and the total consumption exceeded what the Luftwaffe normally received in a week. Or the strategic irrelevance of destroying 300 Allied aircraft when they operated from secure bases with unlimited replacement capacity, while Germany's aircraft industry was being systematically dismantled by bombing raids that hit factories faster than production could relocate underground. Instead, Stenger said nothing, signed the form, and walked out into afternoon darkness that came early in January at 52 degrees north latitude. The base was already being evacuated. Ground crews were loading equipment onto trucks for transport ahead of the Soviet advance that had resumed after pausing to regroup following their breakthrough into Poland. Aircraft sat in revetments awaiting fuel that would not arrive because the refineries at Leuna and Politz had been bombed into inoperability, and the supply system had collapsed to the point where fighter squadrons received weekly allocations measured in hundreds of liters rather than thousands of liters. Stenger had flown his last mission, though he would not know this for certain until mid-April when his unit surrendered to British forces near Hamburg, and he became prisoner of war along with 2 million other Wehrmacht personnel who laid down weapons and walked into captivity with expressions of relief at having survived. The final accounting of Operation Bodenplatte, which showed that Germany destroyed 289 Allied aircraft and damaged 214 more, while losing 237 of its own, with 143 pilots killed or missing and 18 captured. A tactical success that represented strategic suicide, the Luftwaffe's last concentrated blow delivered with such force that it shattered the hand that struck it. Allied aircraft strength recovered within 1 week. American factories replaced losses faster than ships could transport them across the Atlantic, and by mid-January, Allied air superiority had been restored to pre-attack levels with negligible operational impact. German fighter strength never recovered. The pilots lost on January 1st represented irreplaceable experience. The fuel burned could not be replaced from reserves that no longer existed, and the Luftwaffe effectively ceased to function as an organized fighting force, reduced to scattered local defense missions flown by undertrained pilots in obsolete aircraft against enemies who controlled the sky absolutely. Stenger survived the war, returned to Germany in 1947, worked as a commercial pilot until mandatory retirement in 1972, and died in 1989, having never spoken publicly about his participation in Bodenplatte, except during the mandatory debriefing on January 2, 1945. His silence representing either trauma or wisdom, or simply the recognition that what happened, happened, and cannot be changed regardless of how many times it is recounted to men with pens who write reports that gather dust in archives until historians find them decades later and attempt to construct meaning from lists of aircraft destroyed, pilots killed, and fuel consumed in a single morning's violence that changed nothing except the lives of men who participated and died or survived without ever fully understanding whether their sacrifice had purpose beyond the immediate tactical satisfaction of destroying enemy property before they themselves were destroyed. 1st January 1945. Y-29 Asch Advanced Landing Ground, Belgium. 0830 hours. Technical Sergeant Robert Callahan was walking between tents toward the mess hall when the first aircraft screamed overhead at an altitude he estimated at less than 50 meters, the engine note wrong for any Allied type, a harsh mechanical snarl that turned his head upward in time to see the black crosses on gray-green camouflage as a Focke-Wulf fighter flashed past trailing exhaust smoke. The sound of cannon fire reached his ears a half-second later, a rippling crack, crack, crack that merged into continuous noise as more aircraft appeared from multiple directions, at least 40 or 50 in the first wave alone, some strafing in long, shallow dives, while others circled at 300 meters providing top cover. And Callahan sprinted toward the nearest slit trench as the ground around him erupted in dirt geysers where 20mm shells impacted. He dove headfirst into frozen mud that smelled of standing water and last night's rain, rolling to put his back against the earthen wall as explosions began detonating across the airfield. P-47 Thunderbolts cooking off as ammunition stores ignited, turning $250,000 fighters into pillars of black smoke that rose straight up in the windless morning air. The attack had achieved complete surprise. Pilots were still in their quarters, ground crews scattered across the field with no weapons heavier than M1 carbines, and the anti-aircraft positions that ringed the perimeter had skeleton crews, because this was New Year's Day and half the base had permission for late wake-up after celebrations the previous night. Callahan counted 23 distinct fires burning within his field of vision, each representing a destroyed aircraft. And the German fighters made repeated passes with what seemed like unlimited ammunition, their cannons tearing into parked bombers on the northern hardstands, where B-26 Marauders from the 416th Bombardment Group sat exposed without revetments. One pilot, Callahan never learned his name, managed to reach a P-47 and get the engine started, the big Pratt & Whitney radio coughing blue smoke as it caught. But a Messerschmitt Bf-109 rolled in behind him before he could taxi and fired a burst that shattered the canopy and killed the pilot instantly, his fighter rolling forward unmanned until it collided with a fuel truck that exploded in a fireball hot enough that Callahan felt the heat wash over him from 150 meters away. The attack continued in waves, each lasting approximately 8 minutes before the German fighters broke off to circle and regroup, during which brief lulls American personnel attempted to mount organized resistance. Someone got a .50 caliber machine gun operational on the control tower and managed to damage one FW-190 badly enough that it trailed white coolant smoke as it limped eastward. And several ground crew fought back with captured German Kar 98K rifles, kept as souvenirs, their shots probably ineffective, but representing the kind of desperate resistance men mount when their world is disintegrating around them. By 0900 hours, the attack had settled into a pattern. High cover maintaining altitude, while groups of 4 fighters took turns diving through the smoke to strafe anything that moved, and Callahan used one of these rotation gaps to sprint across open ground toward the operations building where radio equipment might still be functional. He made it halfway before cannon shells tracked across his path, forcing him flat against frozen earth, where he pressed his face into dead grass and felt the pressure waves from near misses slam against his helmet. When he raised his head, the operations building was burning, flames visible through shattered windows, and he realized that the Germans had specifically targeted command and control facilities in their first pass. This was not random violence, but carefully planned destruction designed to eliminate the airfield's combat capability. The sound environment had become almost unbearable. Continuous aircraft engines overlaid with cannon fire, exploding ammunition, shouting voices, and the peculiar whipping crack of shells passing overhead at supersonic velocity. Callahan saw Major Thomas Hayes, the base operations officer, attempting to organize a firefighting team near the burning flight line, and he scrambled in that direction, only to watch Hayes disappear in a direct hit from a 250-kilogram bomb dropped by a Ju-87 Stuka that had somehow found its way into the attack package despite being obsolete by 1945 standards. The explosion left a crater 4 meters across, and Hayes simply ceased to exist, vaporized along with 6 men who had been standing within the bomb's lethal radius. At 09:20 hours, the German aircraft suddenly broke off and turned eastward in formation, climbing for altitude, their departure as abrupt as their arrival, leaving behind a scene that resembled industrial accident more than military engagement. Callahan emerged from cover and walked through smoke so thick he tied his undershirt across his face as an improvised filter, counting destroyed aircraft as he passed them. 28 P-47s, 3 B-26s, 2 C-47 transports, 1 British Oster observation plane, all reduced to skeletal frameworks surrounded by cooling metal. The runway was cratered in 7 places, each hole requiring hours of work to fill and compact, and the control tower had collapsed into its own footprint after fire weakened the support beams. Casualty collection began within minutes, medics moving among the wreckage searching for wounded while trying to avoid unexploded ordnance. At least 2 German bombs had failed to detonate and lay half buried in frozen earth, waiting to kill whoever stepped wrong. Callahan helped carry Corporal James Mitchell to an aid station. Mitchell's left leg shattered below the knee from shrapnel, his face white with shock but still conscious enough to ask if his aircraft had survived, and Callahan lied without hesitation, said yes, it's fine, because what purpose would truth serve at that moment? By 0900 hours, reports began arriving via field telephone from other bases. Y-29 Asch had been one of 16 Allied airfields hit simultaneously in a coordinated strike stretching from Brussels to Eindhoven, the largest single-day Luftwaffe operation since 1940. An initial damage assessment suggested over 300 Allied aircraft destroyed or damaged on the ground. The Germans had achieved tactical surprise, had executed their plan with precision, and had demonstrated that even in January 1945, with the Reich collapsing on all fronts, the Luftwaffe remained capable of striking devastating blows when circumstances aligned. But Callahan, standing in the wreckage watching smoke rise from what had been 42 operational fighters that morning, understood something the strategic planners would later confirm in their after-action reports. The Germans had traded irreplaceable pilots and fuel for replaceable aircraft, had spent their last reserve on a single morning's work that would change nothing about the war's inevitable conclusion, and had essentially committed institutional suicide for the satisfaction of bloodying an enemy's nose one final time.